Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk a little bit about the books that I've been reading for Victober, the wonderful event being hosted here on YouTube where people are reading Victorian books that can be novels, but it can also be other things. I've got a surprising amount of other things to talk about today. Editing Celine here to say that I recorded this in the middle of October, but life got busy. I did some travel, I'm changing jobs. And I just didn't have the time to edit this back in October, so for this video we're just going to pretend that it's still October. And the first book that I would like to talk about that I've finished this month is Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I've got this cute little edition from 1902, but I will also put up a picture of the more modern cover of Aurora Leigh. And this is a novel in verse, so it is novel length, but it is written in blank verse. If you don't know, blank verse is a metric form of verse, so it has a certain rhythm on every single line, but it doesn't rhyme. And Aurora Leigh feels like quite an interesting experiment. It's from 1856, and it takes, the Victorian novel that we're relatively perhaps familiar with. So, there's a woman, there's a man, there's some romantic shenanigans, there's some talk about class as well, and it takes all of these themes but then puts them into an epic poem. Now when I think about an epic poem, I usually think about things like, I don't know, the Odyssey, like those heroic things of men taking on some sort of army or some sort of battle or conflict, I don't know. What you usually don't think of is a sort of novel about manners and sort of the smaller things in life. And I think in this way, Aurora Leigh is actually a really fascinating experiment into what it would look like if we take completely different themes that we're probably not used to seeing in poetry, particularly epic poetry, and what happens if you sort of make that into a novel-length project. I also think it's quite interesting that this book was really popular in the Victorian period. Like, a lot of people were really interested in this book, but it's not something that was actually emulated that much. This wasn't really the start of a new tradition of this style of poetry. So it almost feels like this was a very specific experiment, and it almost seems to stand alone a little bit within the tradition of Victorian literature. So the main character is Aurora Leigh, and we start off learning a bit more about her, learning about her tragic past, her mother, her father, she moved from Italy, etc, etc. And one of the biggest opening images is that she is having a conversation with her cousin. And her cousin is like a philanthropist extraordinaire, so he's like really into helping the lower class people in Britain. And he wants Aurora to marry him and be part of that mission, but Aurora is like, no, I am not interested in this, I'm going to be a poet. But the cousin, Romney, is not particularly positive about Aurora's ambitions, and they have a discussion about it, and they basically go their separate ways in life. And the rest of the poem follows Aurora as she goes through some things in life, as she, for example, publishes her poetry. There's a lot going on that I will not spoil for you. I think the aspects that I really liked about Aurora Leigh was particularly the discussion about poetry, literature, art. I think there's quite long passages where Elizabeth Barrett Browning really talks about her vision of art and her vision of literature, and she talks a lot about how it should come from the heart rather than being overly structured, and I thought that all was really interesting, and there are some really lovely passages and some fun little tidbits that I really enjoyed. And I did really enjoy my journey with this book. I actually read it over the course of several months, so I finished it this month, but I didn't read the entirety of it wholly in October. But one of the things that I struggled with, or that I guess just didn't connect with me, was just how religious this text is. This might be a little bit petty, but I went on to Project Gutenberg and just had a little search in the document of this book, and apparently the word God appears 244 times in the entirety of the manuscript of Aurora Leigh. To be fair, it does include words like godlike, so it's not just the word God, but basically anything referring to God is brought up 244 times. And this book is not particularly long, it's about 300 pages in print. And I feel like just the really strong religious aspect of this book became mainly an issue towards the climax of the book. So the climax of the book involves some sort of romantic resolution, but this resolution is couched in like language of religious ecstasy and like a really, really strong religious framework. So the romantic love is almost seen as like this sublime religious experience. And this whole idea of the romance becoming almost like biblical proportions, I just didn't really, it didn't connect with me. I didn't really have a proper frame of reference for this. I didn't enjoy it, to be honest. Overall, I am happy I read it, but I would say that my experience was perhaps a little bit mixed. Then the next book I finished was something completely different. I finished The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. And this is a memoir that was published 1 year later after Aurora, Leigh. And honestly, I feel like these two books couldn't be any different. Mrs. Seacole was a woman who was originally born in Jamaica, but throughout her life she travels to many lands and has many wonderful adventures. If you're someone who gets a little bit frustrated perhaps with the idea of domesticity and the idea of the role of the woman in the Victorian home and all of the constraints that come with that, I feel like you need to read Mrs. Seacole. Because Mrs. Seacole, while obviously being part of Victorian society, and she does refer to value systems within Victorian society, at the same time, she is carving her own way. And if there is one word that I would use to describe Mrs. Seacole, I would call her an entrepreneur. We follow her on some of her travels and some of her adventures. For example, she goes to Panama to open a hotel because her brother is there as well. And at the time, Panama was a pretty lawless place, so there's a lot of danger, there's a lot of shenanigans, there's also a lot of disease. So one of the things that Mrs. Seacole did was help people who had gotten ill, specifically with things like cholera, which was really grim. And reading some of her descriptions of the patients she treats is quite intense. And as we're reading her memoirs, you can sort of tell there's a certain restlessness in Mrs. Seacole. She's always, if there is danger and adventure, she runs towards it instead of away from it. So for example, when the Crimean War starts, she is the person who is like, I am determined to help the soldiers in the Crimean War. So she did apply at the British War Office. She asked to join the nursing team that was being led by Florence Nightingale. She was not accepted in that capacity, so she basically just decided to go there on her own funds and start, again, a form of hotel, except it wasn't really a hotel, it's more of a combination of mess hall and, again, nursing services. And she is definitely a person who clearly was quite fearless, who clearly cared a lot about her patients, who really tried to take care of them in whatever way she could and helped a lot of the, medical personnel that was already present at the war. But at the same time, I feel like she's also just such a businesswoman. If there is money to be made, Mrs. Seacole will be on that. And what I enjoyed most about it is just how much it shatters some of our conceptions of what it is like to be a woman in Victorian times. And on top of that, she was also a woman of colour, which meant that sometimes she experienced racism, and that is also something that she discusses in the book. But she never lets herself be held back because of other people's conceptions. She always finds some way to basically get what she wants or what she needs from a certain situation. I think there are some aspects to this memoir that we might find slightly exasperating. For example, one of the elements that she grapples with in this memoir is that she's basically trying to justify her actions to her peers. She is trying to justify to the Victorian public her actions and uses things like references from army officers who are like, oh yes, I was treated by Mrs. Seacole and she's great. And she actually includes those testimonies in her book, which I think makes perfect sense considering the context that she is writing in and the way that she tries to uplift her own femininity by putting more emphasis on the caring aspect of the work that she does rather than, for example, the financial aspect. But I think at the same time, it's just so fascinating how these things wrap together in her memoir. I also think it's immensely readable. So if you are interested, for example, in history of women in Victorian England, I think this memoir is really great. I think the writing is really accessible. I think it's quite an easy book to get into. It's also not very long, which is also always very helpful in the Victorian period. I'm so glad that this book exists. I'm so glad that this book survives. I'm also really glad that Mrs. Seacole has been getting more recognition over the last couple of decades, and I would honestly highly recommend it, and I think more people should give it a try. Then I also got a non-fiction book about life in Victorian Britain from my library, but I sadly did not finish it. I put it down after the introduction. It was called A Brief History of Life in Britain, A Social History of Queen Victoria's Reign, and it was published in 2008. Now, I understand that when you are fascinated by a historical period, that you want to like that period, and you want to put the people who lived in that period in the best light possible. I get it. I understand the urge to do that. However, what I do not understand has been published, what I do not understand that this author thought was okay to claim, was that during the Victorian period, you know, there was peace in the lands, and that the colonized people enjoyed this peace and were grateful to have been colonized. I think as a historian, when you discuss a time period, it's always important to give, if possible, I know it's difficult, a holistic view of that period. There's always good and bad. I don't think there's a single time in history, in human history, that didn't include, you know, some form of bad. But what we don't do is pretend the bad didn't happen. I honestly just find it completely inexcusable how this author approached the Victorian era. I think we can enjoy parts of the Victorian era, we can enjoy the art, we can enjoy the architecture, while also acknowledging that a ton of the things that made the Victorian era great, perhaps, for example, in architecture, that was done through the exploitation of a lot of vulnerable people all over the world. I also thought there were some iffy things in... To be fair, I've only read the introduction, but the introduction already put me off so much that I didn't think it was worth my time to continue this book. There were already some historical things in the introduction, besides like the really big glaring problem, that I didn't think he presented in a way that seemed right to me. To me, this didn't give the impression of someone who's done a lot of research on the Victorian era. It felt vaguely surface level, too many generalizations, and a sort of misreading of certain facts. Because it felt a little iffy, various aspects of this book, I tried to find more information about the author and I couldn't find a single thing. I couldn't find anything about his perhaps affiliation to any sort of university or research institutes. So I think, honestly, just don't try this one. I honestly don't trust the facts that he does include in this book, and I think from a moral perspective, this book is pretty damn awful. Then, moving on to the books that I am currently reading. One of the books I'm still currently reading is The Return of Sherlock Holmes. This time I actually found the dust jacket of this book, which has Arthur Conan Doyle with his fabulous mustache on it. As always, I'm enjoying Sherlock Holmes. I don't really have that much to say about it at the moment, but I am slowly making my way through this collection. Then another non-fiction about the Victorian era that I have started, but I'm not very far into it. It is The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. I've only read the introduction so far. Luckily for me, this introduction didn't make me angry, so I am very pleased to be continuing in this book. I do think it is quite heavy. Like, the author doesn't pull any punches about how disgusting and awful the living conditions were in this period. So it is something that I think I'm going to be taking slowly rather than reading through this all and then be very depressed for a bit. And then perhaps my biggest project for this month, I am reading Middlemarch, and I'm almost halfway. I think I'm on page 400-ish. Out of 900 in this copy. I'm enjoying it. It's good. I will reserve my thoughts until I've actually finished the book, so I will not tell you anything else. So that was my reading update. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope to see you again soon. I hope that you're reading some really good books, whether they're Victorian or not. And I'll see you soon again. Bye!